I'm Tyrus.
I'm Liz Clayman.
I'm Greg Jarrett, and this is the Fox News Rundown. Monday, October 11th, 2021. I'm Mike Emanuel. Senate Republicans accepted a deal to extend the government's ability to borrow more money until early December. That means the fight over runaway debt and massive spending is merely on hold.
How about members of Congress being concerned about this? Right now, it's just everybody's whistling past the graveyard, Mike. But the debt bomb's going to go off, and it's not going to be pretty when it does.
We speak with Wisconsin Republican Senator Ron Johnson, who is predicting a big debt problem is on the way.
I'm Chris Foster. Crimes That Changed America. Season 2 of the Fox Nation streaming series is out now, hosted by Emily Campagno.
A lot of crimes sure are well known, but what might not be well known are laws that we have that we sort of take for granted in present day, that we don't know that the origin of that law came from a crime.
And I'm Joe Mackey. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
The battle over adding to the national debt is over for now, but the fight is due to return in early December, and Republicans have already pledged that next time Democrats in Congress will not find the same Republican assistance they were granted this time. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy on Sunday Morning Futures.
What's interesting to me is here's the Secretary of Treasury that has a credit card that's maxed out. Instead of finding a way to pay the credit card off, all they think should do is you shouldn't limit how much I can spend. That is what's put us in this problem.
Speaking of the national debt, it is currently approaching $29 trillion and counting. And those in Congress are aware that the debt issue will resurface again soon. While 50 Democrats and 11 Republicans in the Senate voted for the temporary measure to raise the debt limit, Republicans and moderate Democrats were also not pleased when Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer blasted Republicans on the Senate floor after an agreement had been struck.
Leader McConnell and Senate Republicans insisted they wanted a solution to the debt ceiling, but said Democrats must raise it alone by going through a drawn-out, convoluted and risky reconciliation process. That was simply unacceptable to my caucus. And yesterday, Senate Republicans finally realized that their obstruction was not going to work.
There was backlash to the speech from both sides of the aisle, and many in the GOP are maintaining that the debt limit will soon be a Democrat problem once more.
I completely agree with Leader McConnell when he basically told the Democrats that this is their partisan deficit spending, massive amounts.
Republican Senator from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson.
The $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, $700 billion didn't even get spent till 2022 and beyond. And that they had the capability of casting all this deficit spending on their own. They also have the capability of increasing the debt ceiling to accommodate that spending. Now, I led a letter, 46 Republican senators signed on saying, we're not going to help you guys. You need to do this on your own. We did that in early August, but the mainstream media didn't pick up on that. And in the end, Leader Schumer claimed that he just didn't have enough time to use the reconciliation process. So basically what we've done here is we've given them 2 more months now to use the reconciliation process to pass the increase in debt ceiling, with only Democrats. And the reason we're doing that is we believe you need to keep Democrats, to hold them accountable, but also not give them a blank check. What Democrats want to do is just suspend the debt ceiling, which would give them really pretty much a blank check in terms of how much deficit spending they'd be able to pass during the reconciliation process. So we want a number put to it. We want to put some, hopefully have some level of constraint, but also a great deal of accountability.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer could not resist even once the deal was struck. He spiked the ball. Take a listen to this.
Republicans played a dangerous and risky partisan game, and I am glad that their brinksmanship did not work. For the good of America's families, for the good of our economy, Republicans must recognize in the future that they should approach fixing the debt limit in a bipartisan way.
That turned a lot of folks off, including Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Let's play his clip.
I didn't think it was appropriate at this time. We had talked about that. The frustration was built up. And I'm sure Chuck's frustration was built up, but that was not a way to take it out. We just disagree.
Senator Johnson, your thoughts?
Well, I agree with Senator Manchin from a standpoint of not thinking what Senator Schumer was saying was appropriate. I was on the floor of the Senate. I listened to it as well, and I was shaking my head. But again, now they've got 2 months. They can use the budget reconciliation process. That's the process they're using to pass, or trying to pass, a 3.5, which is really about a $5 to $5.5 trillion spending package. They're going to do that on a partisan basis. They should be held accountable. They should take the responsibility for the deficit spending, increase in debt ceiling, and now they got 2 months to do it. So the only excuse, and it wasn't a valid excuse because they were put on notice in August, it's Democrats that played the brinkmanship. Not Republicans. We put them on notice. That's why I had to sign that letter in early August. They had all the time in the world to do this. They got a couple more months, and I appreciated Leader McConnell's letter to President Biden pointing out that fact as well.
The one area where senators from both parties seemed to have some agreement was on a bipartisan infrastructure deal. But then, of course, you've got the progressives insisting that a $3.5 trillion or so tax and spending bill go first. Is a bipartisan infrastructure deal going to get done, or does basically tying these two pieces of legislation together end up blowing them both up?
Well, I think what's interesting about the bipartisan infrastructure deal is Nancy Pelosi guaranteed her Democrats, the Democrat moderates in the House, that they'd be able to vote on this thing, I think it's 2 weeks ago. And, of course, they haven't done that. So Democrats can't even trust Democrat leadership. So how can Republicans? I've always thought, Mike, that I mentioned that $1.9 trillion partisan COVID relief bill, $700 billion not even spent till 2022 and beyond. I've always felt what would be good for our country, because we do need to spend money in infrastructure, but let's not further mortgage our children's future. We should repurpose that $700 billion and spend that on infrastructure. I would have voted for that in a heartbeat. Unfortunately, the bill that was passed adds another $250 billion to our debt, which I did not think was wise. So we always use that as a fallback position, repurpose $700 billion. Again, that should pass in a heartbeat. But once again, Democrats just have to insist on deficit spending.
You bring up an interesting point. My kids watch probably more cable news than most because of what Dad does at 15 and 13 years old. But when they hear the numbers of the debt, that really scares the heck out of them. And they look at me and say, Dad, is your generation going to leave us with the bill? When will Washington ever get serious about the debt problem?
Well, first, let me commend you on being an excellent parent and doing a great job parenting. Not many 13 and 15-year-olds would even consider worrying about the debt. That's too far off in the future, but they should be. Their opportunities will be reduced. How do we get out from underneath this debt bomb? Are we inflating our way out of it? Is that what's happening right now? This is something that every American should be concerned about. Unfortunately, not enough people are. So, again, I appreciate the fact that you're bringing up your children with a measure of responsibility where they are concerned. We just need to get many, many more, not only members of the public, but how about members of Congress being concerned about this? Right now, it's just everybody's whistling past the graveyard, Mike. But the debt bomb's going to go off, and it's not going to be pretty when it does.
Speaking of inflating, any American who drives by a gas station or goes to a grocery store or wherever is seeing bigger prices. It's hitting everybody in the wallet. When will folks get serious about the inflation problem?
Well, when we stop deficit spending. Right now, the definition of inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. We've been paying people not to work. Manufacturers are having to shut down shifts. So there's supply dislocations throughout our economy. You can't offload containers coming in because we don't have enough people working the docks. So you have so many dollars chasing so few goods that inflation has literally wiped out what wage gains Americans have seen over the last few months. So it might feel good to get a raise, but then when you start realizing that even the money you got in your raise isn't paying for as many goods as you used to pay with your old wage level, I hope Americans are starting to pay attention to what Democrat governance results in, and it's going to impoverish this nation.
One area that both parties seem to be focusing on right now, and there seems to be a whole lot of agreement, is there's an issue with Facebook. Facebook is a problem. Your thoughts on what you do about this social media giant that's become a regular part of American life?
Well, first of all, speaking of parenting and being a good parent, limit your children's time on social media outlets. These social media outlets are designed to addict your children to very bad results. The kind of social pressure, the types of depression, we're seeing higher suicide rates. A lot of this is being driven by just the pressure from the social media. From a standpoint of what you can do legislatively, and unfortunately, Democrats like the state of affairs right now. The media, mainstream media, social media, basically run by leftists. And so what they're trying to do is use this to stamp out whatever conservative thought is left on social media. So I think conservatives have to be careful. From my standpoint, I think social media companies absolutely need to be held accountable when they deplatform businesses that built their business on those social media platforms. And the social media companies are not transparent in terms of how they censor, how they deplatform, how they can literally bankrupt companies. So I think that's the first area for laws, regulation. But again, I just don't see Democrats helping out there because it works for them politically.
Senator Ron Johnson of the great state of Wisconsin, thank you so much for your time. Have a great week, sir.
You too. Take care.
If you've been following the news, you've heard about the Great Resignation. But where others see a challenging hiring environment, you could have a golden opportunity. You just need help attracting quality talent. If you're hiring, you need Indeed. Indeed is a hiring partner that gets you what you really want. A short list of quality candidates as fast as possible. Because you can do it all. Attract, interview, and hire all at Indeed. Don't struggle on your own to find quality candidates. Indeed can help you hire the right people right now. Indeed partners with you on every step of the hiring process, so you can find talent with the skills you need through tools like Indeed Instant Match, assessments, and virtual interviews. Get started right now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/Fox News. Get a $75 credit at Indeed.com/Fox News. Indeed.com/Fox News. Offer valid through December 31st. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
This is Joe Mackey with your Fox News commentary coming up.
Sometimes a crime leads to new laws meant to prevent it from happening to other people. The Brady Act led to background checks for gun sales. We get Amber Alerts about missing children. Megan's Law requires states to notify neighbors if a convicted sex offender moves in nearby. The Fox Nation series Crimes That Changed America is about some of those crimes and the laws that followed. Like Joan's Law, passed 14 years after the murder of a 7-year-old girl in New Jersey.
She says, "Bye, Mommy." And I says, "Bye, Joan." And she said, "I'll be right back." And then she never came back.
Season 2 of Crimes That Changed America is streaming now.
I think the phrase and concept of justice here is often elusive. So I argue that what changed really are laws that might have prevented that particular crime from happening.
The series is hosted by Fox News Channel's Emily Campagno.
And so a lot of crimes sure are well known, but what might not be well known are laws that we have that we sort of take for granted in present day, that we don't know that the origin of that law came from a crime after which a law was passed.
Yeah. Carrie Leitner's death, for example, in 1980, we all know now that the drinking age is 21 in every state. That was because a kid was killed by a drunk driver, and there was a TV movie about her, and it was a very well-known case. And tell me about her.
Yeah, exactly. So after 13-year-old Carrie Leitner was killed by a repeat offending drunk driver in California, her mother advocated to increase not only sentencing guidelines, but also to change the national drinking age. And so that's why the national drinking age is 21. And when we say national, right, it's because it's federal. But at the time, it took her mother founding Mothers Against Drunk Driving and then the subsequent advocacy efforts that she undertook to change literally state by state by state, and then to get the president of the United States on board to change the laws from a federal angle that enabled all the other states to then come and fall into line.
The Mary Vincent story, it's heroic and inspiring, but it's still, I watched that episode and it's not an easy watch. It's a rough story.
No, you're absolutely right. This is a really tough story. In fact, it was hard for me to watch the episode. And I grew up just outside of Berkeley, California. And so I grew up knowing about this story. I was born just 1 year after then 15-year-old Mary Vincent was raped and mutilated while hitchhiking California. Her attacker's early release from prison led to new legislation against criminals who permanently disfigure their victims. And this story is in particular so fascinating and so gruesome because it actually touches on a lot of tenets within society. So Mary Vincent was hitchhiking in sort of a typical what was known as a hitchhiker's corridor in an alley right outside of UC Berkeley, where kids in those days would just catch rides. And she was trying to get to her grandfather's house, and instead she was picked up by a former merchant marine who took her first to his home in Marin County. And afterwards, in subsequent interviews, he asked her to help him load up the car, right? He said, we're just going to stop by my house, load up the car, and then I'll take you there. And
then he stopped and pulled her out of the van, and there's a ravine on both sides of the road. And he pulled her out and laid her down on the ground and pulled her arm out, and he chopped it off with an axe, just mid-forearm. Spun her around and chopped off the other arm. He then drug her over to the edge of the culvert, which had a slight concrete embankment on it, pushed her over it, and dropped her off into the culvert.
She put mud on her bloody stumps to stay the bleeding, and essentially after one car drove away in horror after seeing this bloody figure, another one stopped. So she was saved, and then an incredible manhunt ensued. And the police there worked across many different agencies and jurisdictions, and even used hypnosis on Mary Vincent to accurately obtain an image of this individual, and also to figure out where that house was located in Marin. And then they got him, they prosecuted him, and he had a light sentence because at the time, the torture, the actual legal definition of mayhem is dismemberment, essentially. It really wasn't that long. So he got out. But when he got out of prison, no community in California wanted him. It's a really fascinating story where literally every single town, including my own that I grew up in, said, we don't want this murderer, this disgusting monster living with us. So when he was finally released off parole, he then moved to Florida where he was from originally, and he killed again. That was to no surprise to anyone involved with that first crime. And Mary Vincent flew across the country and testified at his trial, and she raised her then hooked arms, and it was such a powerful, compelling testimony, and he was sentenced to death. He ended up dying in prison of cancer, but that is an incredible episode that touches on so many different things legally, and especially for those true crime fans out there, that's a really strong episode.
The most recent case in this season, too, is Savannah LaFontaine Gray wins. This is a baby stealing case and a murder in North Dakota 4 years ago. How did the law do her a disservice?
Well, it's what changed after that elevated the unfortunate, really tragic trend in our country of murdered and missing Indigenous women. So Savannah's law, which is a law that President Trump signed into effect, is the law that has sort of been part of the national conversation lately, which forces communication between local, state, and federal jurisdictions on the topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. There are frightening statistics, not only of the missings and the murders, but also of the subsequent responses by law enforcement and the lack of information that is transferred to enable law enforcement to respond, investigate, and bring to justice the kidnappers and or murderers. So Savannah LaFontaine Greywind was murdered by her neighbors, actually. She was pregnant at the time, and it was an extremely brutal, horrifying murder where her fetus was cut from her body. The baby survived. She did not. But it led to, there was such a national horror over this. And again, on top of the constant dismay of the Indigenous population, that this is just one of countless statistics of a murdered Indigenous woman, that it led to legislation that carried over actually through 2 congressional terms and 2 senators to get it passed that elevated this topic, and that again forces the communication and the resources that will be deployed to hopefully tamp down this, again, really tragic statistic of just how many there are of the murdered and missing Indigenous women throughout our country.
Tell me about Jones Law. That girl's killer coincidentally just died himself in prison a few months ago.
Joan D'Alessandro in 1973 was 7 years old, and she left her mother to go across the street. She said, her mother said, she just grabbed 2 boxes of Girl Scout cookies. She had 2 left to sell, and she had been waiting all day for her neighbor to get home so that she could sell him the final 2 boxes. So she ran across the street, and her mother says, I remember just my last view of her was her little ponytail like flopping in the wind as she trotted across the street, and she never returned home. And her mother then became, and it's similar to the Carrie Leitner story, that her mother became an incredible advocate. And at the time, the laws were such that this poor mom and her husband, the father of Joan, they had to testify at the parole release hearings of this murderer who didn't deny his guilt and murdered the 7-year-old girl in an extremely brutal, violent fashion. They had to testify over and over and over again at his parole hearings. And it was incredibly traumatizing for them and triggering for them throughout the years. And so Joan eventually got the law changed. It gave you a life sentence without the possibility of parole if in the commission of a murder of a 14-year-old or younger, they've been murdered along with sexual assault. And another analog was passed after that, which was 17 and younger as well. So due to her efforts, this incredible mother's efforts, it ensured that nothing like that would ever happen again.
And finally, there's this episode about Kaylee Anthony's death. She was the 2-year-old girl killed in 2008.
Her mother's partying and living the life. She was girls gone wild while her kid was missing.
Her mother, Casey, was found not guilty of her murder after a very long publicized trial. Jurors said the evidence just wasn't there. The defense said it was an accidental drowning. She was convicted of lying to police, though, and she admits that. What did you come away from the show thinking? Did anything in your mind change about the case? And then we can talk about the law that has now been passed in some states.
Nothing changed my mind about the case, but I think this is just another example of where the court of public opinion is different than the court of law, and that we can all be convinced of someone's guilt, and yet all that matters is that jury of 12 or the jury of 10 or 9 in certain states. So I think this just underscores that, and it underscores as well people's shock when the verdict is not what you expect and is not what you think or to be true based on your heart and based on everything that's been portrayed in the media. This episode does an incredibly thorough job of taking us through exactly what happened, exactly through that media spectacle. You're right, and what happened, the trial, and outlines the shock that we all felt. And then it goes into the subsequent legislation that you brought up, so which I think the majority of the public might not realize.
They came into the governor's office and spoke to us about this idea of how quickly a trail goes cold on a child. And so that if you can get the information as quickly as possible, you can bring tremendous human resources to bear and technological resources to bear to try to find the child before whoever has abducted the child brings harm to them.
We all know the story of little Kaylee Anthony and her murder, and now, not sure who did it in terms of the law, but many people don't realize that there is now in these states it's a felony if you know or should have known that a child was missing or endangered and you do not report it to law enforcement immediately.
Emily Campagno, it's I was forwarded a couple of these episodes to get a look at, and they're, as usual, they're really good. It's called The Crimes That Changed America, Season 2, streaming now on Fox Nation. Emily's also co-host of Outnumbered, of course, weekdays on Fox News Channel. Emily, thanks a lot. It's always good to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for watching.
Hey, it's Brett Larson, inviting you to download and listen to the new daily Fox on Tech podcast. There's part of a colorful late 90s iMac on Mars. It's an idea that seems a lot like Kickstarter, called Build It. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Here's a look at the week ahead.
Monday is a federal holiday marking the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas. Many communities have renamed Columbus Day as Native Americans or Indigenous People Day. Monday will also see the return of the Boston Marathon. Last year's event was canceled because of the pandemic, the first such interruption in its 124-year history.
Tuesday.
William Shatner makes the move from science fiction to reality when he's scheduled to make a suborbital flight aboard Blue Origin's New Shepard space system. The 90-year-old actor, best known as the captain of the Starship Enterprise, will become the oldest person ever to reach space.
Thursday.
An FDA advisory panel begins 2 days of meetings to discuss authorizing booster shots for Johnson & Johnson's single-dose and Moderna's 2-dose coronavirus vaccines. Pfizer's vaccine has already been approved as a booster.
Friday.
The deadline to file your 2020 tax returns if you filed for an extension. And that's a look at your week ahead. I'm Rich Dennison, Fox News.
Jason in the House, the Jason Chaffetz podcast. Dive deeper than the headlines and the party lines as I take on American life, politics, and entertainment. Subscribe now on foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts.
Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Joe Mackey.
What's on your mind?
Be the change you want to see in the world. That's a phrase I see on bumper stickers all the time. But these days it may as well read, "My kid beat up your honor student," because not enough people want to be the change they want to see in the world. Unless they saw the movie The Postman and thought, this dystopian wasteland looks nice. More and more prefer winning at all costs, even when victory's price is becoming the thing you hate. That happened last week. People protested a senator's position they felt lacked empathy and compassion. Then in the name of empathy and compassion, they filmed and harassed her as she ducked into a bathroom stall. They went from civil disobedience to no civility. This was no longer about making views heard. It was about sending a message. Do what we want or this will happen. At least there wasn't a swirly. Is that the change you were hoping for? A marketplace of ideas exchanged for mob rule? I'd get a better trade at a used car lot. Thinking it's okay to harass and film a woman in a bathroom stall over her politics is like saying she brought it on herself. That's how abusers think. Any end justifies the means. When a mob stalks and harasses and intimidates, it's no longer a protest, it's a weapon. And once a weapon is created, it can be used against you. I say that not as a threat. You won't see me filming my political opponents in a bathroom, and I condemn anyone who would. Rather, I say it as a eulogy for the change you wanted to see in the world. And as for the kid who beat up your honor student, maybe he didn't like that other kid's politics, just like those people in that bathroom. I'm Joe Mackey. Go to joemackey.com, JOEMACHI.com for tour dates, and thank you.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. From on the Fox News Podcasts Network.
I'm Ben Domenech, publisher of The Federalist, and I'm inviting you to join a new conversation with the smartest thinkers out there about the country and where we're going. Subscribe to the Ben Domenech Podcast.
Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Hi, everybody. It's Brian Kilmeade. I want you to join me weekdays at 9 a.m. East as we break down the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest newsmakers and, of course, what you think.
Listen live or get the podcast now at BrianKilmeadeShow.com.